Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the University of York 2024 Autumn Lecture Series. My name is Öznur Yardımcı. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the School for Business and Society at the University of York. My research focuses on politics of citizenship and city. So today I am delighted to interview Professor Indrajit Roy about his new book, Audacious Hope. Indrajit is Professor of Global Development Politics in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of York. He specializes in the study of Indian politics in comparative and historical perspectives. So, Audacious Hope, an archive of how democracy is being saved in India, is a careful and rigorous archive of the struggles of the ordinary folks in India who have stood up to repressive state authority over and over again, and their vital acts of hope preserve the collective spirit of resistance and unwavering resilience necessary to continue to fight for democracy. So thank you very much, Indrajit, for being here today to talk about your book. And just a little reminder that the recording of this event will be available on the Festival's York Ideas YouTube channel as well, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival. And you will be contacted by email when the video is available to view. And if you would like to purchase a copy of Indrajit's book, Audacious Hope, an archive of how democracy is being saved in India, it will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books, foxlanebooks.co.uk. So, welcome, Indrajit. How are you?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. I'm excited to hear your insight.
Likewise. Yes.
Yes.
Glad to talk about it. Yes.
Yes. So I guess we can start with the general question of like, what are the challenges do you think that democracy faces today?
Thanks. Thanks. I think that's a really useful way to think about this book, which is, after all, about how democracy is being saved. So I think it's important to understand what the challenges facing it are, from which people are trying to save it. Now, we often tend to think of democracy as about regular elections or about the rule of the people. And the rule of the people is often assumed to be the rule of the majority. But I think it's really important to bear in mind that, and this is a major challenge, that the rule of the majority is being often interpreted as majoritarian rule, which is another way of saying that it's about imposing the will of the majority on minorities. I think we have to think about democracy in broader terms. Democracy is not only about regular elections or about the rule of the majority. Democracy is about a process through which people can assert their equality before one another and before the law. It's a social process, not just about regular routine procedures. It's about treating people with respect. It's about treating even political adversaries with respect. It's about affording dignity to people, irrespective of their backgrounds. It's about welcoming dissent. Democracy is crucially linked to dissent. And if you look at these elements, social equality, treating people with dignity, treating political adversaries with respect, and the question of dissent, you see how each of these is withering away, is being stifled, is being clamped down on. And in my view, these are the general challenges that democracy faces today. The fear of majoritarian rule, not treating adversaries with respect, stripping them of their dignity, and clamping down on dissent. I think these are the challenges that democracy faces today across the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what do you think makes India an interesting case study to? I mean, why did you write a book about specifically India to talk about these challenges?
I think in many ways, India exemplifies the promises as well as the challenges that democracy is going through. It is, of course, called the world's largest democracy, and for good reason. You have such a large number of people who take part regularly in elections. and elections that are held at several levels, not only at the central level, but also at the provincial, district, and sub-district level. So, it's elections are like, India's largest festival, if you will. People take elections very seriously. At the time when India became independent, back in 1947, and adopted its republican constitution in 1950, very few people had imagined India to survive as a democracy. They believed that it was too poor, too illiterate, too diverse. There was largely agricultural. It was a largely agricultural society, and so a lot of the attributes that people associated with democracy back then were simply missing in India.
Mm.
Yet India emerged as a democracy with universal adult suffrage, that is, every adult had the right to vote, and instituted elections back in 1952. And for context, this was about 15 years before the then superpower, the United States, introduced free and fair elections. Remember, the US had segregation laws and literary qualifications on its, that sort of limited its black minorities' ability to vote. So, in some ways, India overcame the structural sort of problems that are often associated with democracy, and was able to consolidate a democracy, warts and all. It was not the perfect democracy, but it sort of emerged as a democracy with equal rights for all, where political adversaries were to be treated with respect. Dissent was allowed, tolerated, and in time even welcomed. Over decades, India's various communities were able to assert their presence in India's parliament, as well as in the various sort of provincial assemblies. And in some respects, the Indian story was a very moving story of the promises of democracy and the way in which democracy can achieve a great deal for some of the poorest people on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
But we also find that those achievements are increasingly under threat. They've been under threat for a few years now, but particularly since 2014, when a government which aligns with Hindu nationalist ideas, the ideas that India's lifeblood is associated with its majority Hindu religion, that many of those achievements are under threat and eroded. And I think it is a significant challenge before democracy worldwide, because democracy in India is a public good. It's a global public good. It sort of shows that India shows that democracy is not the preserve of the rich white West, if you will. It is something that people world over can embrace and can sort of work with. Obviously, you can't expect democracies everywhere to be exactly alike because people are different. But it does show that democracy is a worldwide good, and its retrenchment in India, its sort of erosion in India, is therefore something of concern. And I thought if you wanted to, write about the ways in which people are sort of working with democracy and trying to save their democracy, we just cannot ignore India. And, it's a big country and there's so much going on. And I thought that it would be useful to sort of present the India story and the ways in which ordinary Indians are trying to sort of save their democracy as a way of thinking about how democracy worldwide might be protected and renewed.
Yeah, that's really important because, yeah, we know that from the day it was first invented, democracy has never been fully achieved, has never been perfect anywhere. I mean, think about the idea of citizenship, for example, and its claim to universality. We know that everywhere there were just, I mean, in practice, it was very exclusive to certain groups. So there is something that makes the challenges democracies are facing today more urgent or more different than before. And yeah, as you explained very well, India makes a good case to focus on how the promises of democracy are just turning upside down, and the story is changing. So let me move to the more exciting focus of the book, like the hope. So you in the book, you argue that hope fuels the individual or collective action, countering democratic backsliding and erosion. But this may sound weird to some audiences. I mean, don't we need like more powerful emotions like anger to feel like meaningful, real political action? Or isn't hope something about waiting for good things to happen and sustaining with the little you have and enduring the pain in the meantime? So,
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question because it comes up again and again in sort of conversations around what can be done around democracy, and of course, and especially Indian democracy. Given what you just said earlier about how democracy is a fundamentally incomplete process, it's a work in progress, right? Because there have always been exclusions. And so, people are like, okay, this has always happened. Let's just hope that things get better, So in a way that hope is in this regard, you could almost say this is a very passive way of thinking about hope. You wait for things to happen. And lots of scholars have indeed sort of warned against hope. They say that hope sort of keeps you, it's a rope, it's a shaman's trick, as it were. It sort of keeps you waiting for something, and eventually you don't know when things go wrong. Now, I think that's a very limited way of thinking about hope. And if you look at the work of, activists, people who've actually sort of worked to challenge either segregation in the United States or the authoritarian regimes in Brazil, I'm thinking of people like Bell Hooks and Paulo Freire. They will tell you that hope is very much about action. It's very much about doing things. It's very much about not giving up, as it were. It's about acting against injustice. It's about denouncing abuse. It's a very positive, a very actionable thing. It is an emotion, of course, and it may be drawn on anger and even on resentment, if you will. The fact that you believe that you should be treated as equals and you're not being treated in the way that you believe you should be treated, generates resentment. But then you don't just stop there. You don't sort of sit in a corner with a sullen face. You actually take action. And you mentioned something which is very important in thinking about hope. We often think about hope as existing inside individuals' heads. But I think if you think about hope in this actionable way, where you take action to sort of push forward your ideas, hope is also a collective emotion, right? It's about how you talk to others and you work with others to build solidarity against the kinds of injustices and inequalities that you are facing. And you decide that you've got to work together. So in some respect, I respect, of course, the view that hope might, be antithetical to political action because of the circumstances of the writers who were writing in that vein. But and I'm thinking about, say, Hannah Arendt, who wrote about the Jews in Germany and, how they were hoping for deliverance, which never came, as we know. But then there are examples across the world where people did take action. They did sort of work together. They refused to give up, and they reached out to others, forged bonds of solidarity in very difficult times, and worked with that solidarity to sort of take things forward. To my socialist-minded friends, I always remind them of Karl Marx's, famous words. The workers of the world have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. And in some respect, he was writing about workers in very, very difficult circumstances. Remember, those were days before you had full-fledged democratic rights. And we know that the workers, they may not have established, a workers' state, or a dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx would have it, but they did manage to push the frontiers of democracy further, right? And I think to my sort of leftish friends, I always remind them of this adage.
yeah, that's great. And this also This is also very striking because hope is, I mean, as you explain it, it's something very worldly, very
Yes.
material. Like,
Yes.
like it's not
Yes.
something, it's not just an illusion, just an idea or an emotion. It's very powerful. I mean, do you want to elaborate
Indeed,
more?
indeed. Thank you. Yes. I mean, I think that's also something that I find often gets ignored. Yes, of course, hope is a powerful emotion,
Mhm.
but it's very worldly, as you put it. It exists in the here and now. It draws on the very real sorts of issues that make you angry, that generate resentment. Yeah. Um, and it's about identifying what's wrong with the situation and what you can do with these sorts of material that you have before you, right? So it's very worldly, it's based on the very material problems that you have, but also on the material solutions that you might have. And here I've drawn a distinction between hope and utopia, which I think would be interesting to you and this audience. Utopia is about imagining a perfect world, where everything's absolutely right, spot on. Um, Hope is much more political than that. Hope is imperfect. It's necessarily a work in progress. Like democracy, as you mentioned, it's a work in progress. You sort of work with what you have. You don't have a perfect world, but you aim for and achieve something that's slightly better than what you have. I think it's important to recognize, because of the worldly nature of hope, that hope respects and understands grief. That there is a problem before you. You've got to deal with that problem. You've got to recognize that the past may never come back, that, the old ways of living are gone. And you've got to work on the basis of the sorts of coalitions and the sorts of solidarities that you can build, rather than the sorts of alliances that other people would want you to build, if that makes sense. So it's about working with what you've got. There are, environmental activists, for instance, Moreover Johnson, who, faced with the climate calamity, for instance, says that we've seen the end of the world, and we've decided not to accept it. These are her quotes. And what she means by this is that, yeah, there are huge problems before us, but we're going to work and do our best with what we have. That includes immediate sorts of actions, but also sorts of collective solidarities that are based on the here and now, that are very worldly. And hope here is also very realist then, because it's based on what's actually possible. Often we are told, that, oh, the days of the 1960s were great, when the students marched to the barricades, in Europe. And great, good for them, but that world is gone. It's not coming back. And while it's great to be nostalgic about that past, we've got to recognize that the world today is very different. Governments have learned from their own mistakes in the past and have done what they can to sort of separate you out and to, sow divisions. And you've got to work with the material that you have, rather than, want to bring the past back. So it's good to grieve that those sort of past moments have gone, but you've got to sort of work with what you have. And the people I describe in this book, are great examples of how you do that, how you work with what you've got, rather than simply bemoan the loss of a glorious past, and or hope for a utopian world to magically appear.
Yeah, I was
But
just
thanks for picking that up. I think
yeah,
the
I was
worldliness
just
is important.
Yeah, I was just going to come to the case studies that you selected in the book, and you examine a range of different cases where hope operates as a fuel, as a tool, uh, making possible the positive, political action. And you give examples like student protests, anti-caste movements, and civic activism, which may be regarded more usual suspects.
Mm,
But you
yeah.
also talk about an interesting case about farmers on the march, because farmers, they tend to be the, humble, ordinary, often religious conservative segments of the society, which are not necessarily associated with political action and activism. So do you want to elaborate more on that?
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you picked on that because I think the farmers, or lots of people call them peasants or agriculturalists, etc. Of course, they're considered the least politicized of society, and I think it was Marx who famously called them a sack of potatoes. They just sit and do nothing.
Mm.
But of course, as you mentioned, this chapter, which is titled "Farmers on the March," is about farmers who protest. Agricultural laws in India that sought to remove state protections, governmental protections to farm prices, and leave them at the mercy almost of the market and its fluctuations. And so the farmers who, for the last 5 decades or so, have been supported by a range of government policies, including price support systems and controls that are helpful to them, were protesting the removal of those support systems. And you're right. You could say that their sort of protests were entirely motivated by self-interest. It was only to sort of get back to a normal life, in the sense, get back to what they were used to.
Mhm.
And I think that's exactly where the worldliness of hope sort of comes in. You evaluate the situation you are in, and you see what's best that's possible. And you join forces with others who may not share the exact same goals as you, but are, generally sympathetic to your overall cause. I think the farmers were able to, cut across the religious divides across them, which sometimes the government actively sowed. At other times, there were existing religious divides that threatened to sort of explode. As you can imagine, farmers across northern India, many of them are Hindus, but of course, you have large Muslim minorities who are also farmers, and you have a very large Sikh communities, members of the Sikh community who are also farmers. And over the last decades, there have been lots of clashes between Hindus and Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs, which I describe in the book. What was interesting was the ways in which the farmers were able to overcome those divisions and insist on working together. The government actively tried, alongside compliant media, actively tried to sow divisions between the Hindus and the Muslims, and perhaps most tragically, the Hindus and the Sikhs, calling the Sikh farmers secessionists, labeling them terrorists, saying that they were funded from abroad, insinuating that they were trying to break up India's unity and that sort of thing. But what we saw was the farmers' leaders reaching out across these divisions and insisting that the farmers work together. Of course, there was self-interest in it, that they wanted to sort of get the farm laws to be repealed. They wanted, to have more of state controls rather than less of it, because, of course, state controls were good for them in terms of their ability to, reap profits and to lead better lives. But what was interesting was the way in which they were able to overcome these divides that the government was actively sowing, as well as sections of the media were sowing. What was also interesting was the way in which people who were not farmers came out in support of the farmers. Oftentimes, these included, people from much poorer backgrounds, agricultural laborers, and people who you might say that they are the ones the farmers exploit the most, right? And there were some colleagues who pointed out how the farmers were arm twisting their agricultural laborers to sort of support their movements. But others showed that oftentimes the laborers, the workers, agricultural workers, rural workers, were supporting the farmers of their own volition, because as far as they could see, farming was important. And they would deal with the farmers later, but right now they wanted these unpopular laws to be repealed. So the ways in which Self-interest may have been the trigger, the starting point, but people were each able to overcome divisions
Mhm.
and broaden out and gain solidarity from others and receive solidarity from others was, I think, an important reason I included this particular mobilization in the book. Now, I have to say that the farmers' movement was the most successful of all the movements that I've described. And part of it may well have to do with the demography that we're talking about. A large majority of them were Hindus. They were from northern India. And although the BJP, that is the ruling party, is not very popular in the villages, it's a much more urban party than a rural one. They were very worried about alienating the farmers even more. India is a largely agricultural country. Farmers are culturally, socially considered to be the country's lifeblood, and they didn't want to alienate them in a way that they didn't have to worry when it came to students or the sort of anti-caste movement protagonists. So the farmers did enjoy some advantages over the other groups. We shouldn't ignore that.
Mhm.
But they still were able to reach out to others and receive support from others, which I thought made this movement so interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And it also speaks, I mean, it also tells something about how contagious hope can be, you know.
Indeed, yes, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I think that's something I don't address in the book very much because it stops at a certain time. But yes, it is a contagion which lots of people in authority don't like.
Yes, it does contage in a much smaller, speed compared to the more, authoritarian, maybe fascist ideas, but it does.
Indeed,
So
indeed.
yeah, bringing the topic to more recent topics about populism. Um, over the past 2 decades, the society, not only in India but across the world, they seem to have strived for what seems to be offered by right-wing, populist, authoritarian leaders, not only, I mean, as I said, in India, but elsewhere. So how do you interpret these popular support for populist leaders? I mean, the support from those left behind or marginalized, exploited communities. We can maybe argue that people like Modi or Erdogan or Trump, coming from, I mean, not Trump, but Modi and Erdogan, coming from very humble backgrounds, are they giving people hope? I mean, is it the reason why they managed to gather so much power? Is it because they mobilized the desire for hope for a better
Yeah.
future?
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, and this is something I sort of grapple with early on in the book. What explains Modi's rise, or for that matter, Erdogan, or even Trump. I mean, yeah, he is a businessman, as we know, very sort of wealthy one at that. But his railings against the elite obviously strike a chord, and there are ways in which you could argue that these gentlemen, if you can call them that, spark a lot of hope. And I think we've got to sort of recognize the resonances of their promises with large numbers of people. These are people, and of course, some of their support comes from those who are left behind, as you put it. Others may not actually be left behind, but perceive themselves to be left behind. They may have been marginalized thanks to the democratic assertions of the previous 4 decades. And believe that their positions of power are now threatened, and that they are not as influential as they used to be. So there are those who are left behind. There are those who perceive themselves to be left behind or complain that they are left behind. And I think the promises of restoring a golden age, or whether it's the civilization in Turkey or India, or making America great again, that these are sorts of hopes that exist, that sort of are very, very real. But I think it's also important to recognize the limitations of the hope, if you want to call it that, that these guys offer. And that hope is inevitably built upon exclusions. You sort of build a hope for a glorious Hindu past, or you build a hope for a glorious Christian past, or a hope for a glorious Muslim past, depending on who you are. And I think that has, of course, promises inclusion if you are Hindu, Muslim, Christian, depending on who you are, but also in, sort of foments exclusions. If you're not Hindu, if you're not Muslim, you're not Christian, then no thanks, you're not part of the party. So I think the exclusionary messages that people like Bolsonaro, Trump, or Erdogan or Modi sort of give, the exclusionary basis of their hope is something that we've got to recognize.
Mhm.
In the book, I draw a distinction between hope that's builds solidarities and sort of brings people together versus an emotion that seeks to divide. That offers you hope because so that you are able to push down somebody else. So I'll make you great by sort of stomping down over somebody else. That's not hope, that's fear. That's sort of saying that, if you don't sort of come with me, that guy's going to take away what you've got. And this is the messaging that Trump gives. This is the messaging that Erdogan gives. This is the messaging that Modi also gave. Although in his first sort of few years in government, he did make some promises about inclusive development, development for all. But if you see what his party workers were actually doing, what followers who sympathized with him were actually doing, it was quite different. And we could have sort of said, okay, those are fringe elements. The government will take care of them. But the government didn't. And that shows there's a sort of wink, wink, you go on doing what you will, and I'll sort of, carry on giving certain messages. Doesn't sort of, is not the stuff of hope. So I think you're right in the sorts of aspirations that people like Modi and Erdogan sort of build on. But these are aspirations that are built on oppressing others, on putting down others, on excluding others. And that's not hope. That's something else. It's not hope.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask if we should divide, make a distinction between hope that is regressive or emancipatory, but
Yeah.
maybe we should call it something else other than
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there is something to be said about recognizing what promises of hope are built on. And if there's fear that's underpinning hope, then you've got to sort of recognize that it's hope that's based on the foundation of fear. And it could be the fear of being taken over by the migrant, by the minority, by non-Muslims, depending on your pick. And I think this distinction you draw is important. There is an emancipatory hope. There is something to be said about, hope that sort of believes in building a better world for all, not a perfect world, but a world that's better for all. Vis-a-vis supremacist hope, hope that's built on asserting the supremacy of your people, whether they are Muslims in Turkey, Hindus in India, or Christians in Brazil, evangelicals in America, depending on what the context is. I don't think any one religion or culture is uniquely sort of attuned towards this sort of supremacist hope, just as no one culture is uniquely attuned towards emancipatory hope either. So it's something that crisscrosses cultures, I think.
Yeah, yeah, great. Um, so, uh, looking to the future, I mean, these authoritarian populist leaders, they seem to be losing the power that they had over the past decade, as we saw in the recent elections in India as well. So do you think that signals an emerging public appetite for more emancipatory forms of hope?
I'd be careful about hoping. I mean, I'm a cautious hoper, if you will. Obviously, when the Indian election results were announced, it was heartening to see that despite all the resources at the disposal of the ruling party, they were not able to win a majority on their own. They relied on allies. And many of these allies have backgrounds that are leftish, not leftist, leftish, socialist, regional, and you could say they're opportunists, and opportunism works in all sorts of very interesting ways. But what was interesting was that the ruling party lost its domineering, crushing majority in the parliament. And so you're right, that does give some hope that alternate views of what people would like the government to be like, not so domineering, not so majoritarian, still enjoy some sort of public support, and that people are willing to, come out and vote accordingly. I think elsewhere in the world, Brazil is a great example of how Bolsonaro, the right-wing sort of populist in their country, faced a defeat. And the Workers' Party came to power, so showing that there was clearly an appetite for a more emancipatory sort of politics. As with the United States, although we'll have to see what November shows for the US. And indeed, in Turkey, I think there were municipal elections which in Istanbul, which Erdogan's party lost. So I think there is a pushback that we can we can only see that grow. In the Indian context, I think we should remember that because of the federal nature of Indian politics, there are many states where Hindu nationalism does not enjoy a great deal of support. But you do have other local authoritarians who, sort of fill in the vacuum. So this is, to be clear, not just about, being pro-BJP or anti-BJP. It's about a certain, as you said, a certain set of values which may be supportive of authoritarian populism or sort of push back against it. So we've got to be careful when we see these parties being defeated. We've got in elections, we've got to see who's defeating them. But even if you see who's defeating them, I think the parties with a broadly liberal political values, broadly inclusive, let's say, because liberal has its own connotations, but broadly inclusive sorts of political values do well in elections. And I think that's a good thing. That sort of shows, as you say, a public appetite for more emancipatory hope. I think that's exactly it. That doesn't mean we'll have a revolution tomorrow. I think hope is not about revolution. Hope is about incremental changes. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. It's those incremental changes that make politics so interesting.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah, I agree about being careful, but also keeping the hope element alive as vibrant as possible. So I think we can now move to the Q&A. Thank you so much for this enlightening and thought-provoking conversation. So because we already have 2 questions from the audience. So the first one is an anonymous attendee, and they ask, how do you think the pandemic has affected democracy in India and hope in relation to that?
Oh, that's a really good question. There's a chapter in the book on this, by the way. I think it might help to sort of address it. Now, the pandemic came to India at a very interesting time. In December 2019, the Indian government had introduced an amendment to the Indian Constitution that for the first time ever sort of put religion as a filter for citizenship. And there were enormous protests against this measure. It was, to cut a long story short, the measure, the policy would sort of exclude Muslims from acquiring citizenship in India, and sort of introduce a longer waiting time for Muslims, but not for others. And there's a deep history that sort of goes into this amendment. But so there were enormous protests against this move, and protests that were not only led by Muslims, but by everyone else, Hindus, Sikhs, everyone. So it was really, an example of interreligious solidarity. The pandemic when the pandemic struck, of course, the government invoked social distancing laws, and it promptly sort of took action against the protesters and banned protests. Protests are great for democracy, but were not great for, in a situation of the pandemic. And so in some ways, the pandemic provided an opportunity for the government to clamp down on dissent even more than before, because of course it was doing it in the interest of public health. And the protesters had sort of come up with a lot of protest art in various cities, including the capital. And the government took this opportunity to not only clamp down on the protest, but also clean up the protest art. Now, one is not sure what the protest art would have had to do with the pandemic per se, because I can see people communicating the disease, not the artworks. But that sort of gave you a good idea of how the government was responding to protests under the garb of responding to the pandemic. So I think the pandemic did sort of serve to encourage the government to clamp down on dissent. The government was able to acquire enormous powers to try and keep people at home, effectively, of course, blocking any kind of on-site protests. I think this audience might be familiar with images in the first half of 2020 when the Prime Minister announced a nationwide lockdown with 4 hours notice. And obviously, the idea was to keep people at home, but it had the opposite effect because people were so worried and frightened. They wanted to sort of, be with their loved ones. Many Indians work in areas that are different from where they were born and where their families are. They're internal migrants, in short. And when the lockdown was announced, they wanted to get back home to their loved ones. And of course, the government was, trying its best to limit mobility without much success. But I think the pandemic gave the government a great deal of authority and power, all in the name of public health, which you could say was, detrimental to democratic values. I'm not suggesting that the government had no role in controlling the pandemic. I think states do have and should have a role in, when there's a public health crisis. But I think it's important to be able to focus on public health rather than sort of, use that as an excuse to clamp down on on protests. In terms of the second part of your question, I think that very moment also generated a great deal of hope. This was a time when religious divisions were at their, were soaring because of the sort of religious filter that had been introduced in the Citizenship Act. And there was a great deal of mutual suspicion between Hindus and Muslims. The pandemic, I think, reminded everyone that people have a finite amount of time on this earth, and you can either spend that fighting with each other or you can spend that caring for each other. And there were enormously moving scenes where Hindus and Muslims who worked together, who might have been at each other's throats a few months before, were simply looking after one another because there was nothing else to do. You saw Hindus ferrying Muslims to the nearest hospitals. You saw Muslims sort of working with Hindus to give them succor. There are instances in the book. It was a very painful chapter to write, I have to say, where Hindu friends and were sort of looking after their Muslim colleagues and co-workers at a time when no one wanted to touch the body because they didn't know what the disease was about. And likewise, you had Muslims taking care of Hindus in far-flung areas because nobody wanted to, get involved because those were early days. Nobody quite knew how the disease spread. It was a very painful chapter to write because also it's so immediate, right? But I'm glad I wrote it because it was a way of thinking about the here and now of hope. What do ordinary people, really ordinary people, do in times of such crisis when the end of the world is nigh, right? So, but thanks for that question. Thank you.
So we have another one from Constanza, and it's thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to know, how do you think the concept of hope and resilience could be related in the development of a democracy?
Thank you. I've often been asked, why do I talk about hope and why not resilience? And I think it's important to sort of think about both together. Obviously, resilience lets you sort of deal with problems, but I think hope is a little more than just dealing with problems. Hope is about using that as an opportunity. Hope it's about using crisis as an opportunity, not just to cope with crisis, but also to imagine a better world and to work together with people to improve your situation, even if it's ever so slightly. But it's about really taking action. I think obviously, there is such a thing as democratic resilience. How resilient societies are in order to ensure that their democracies don't crumble. But I think the element of hope sets in once democracy or that democratic resilience is sort of cracked. Once the erosion of democracy set in, then what? And I think, looking at democracy from the perspective of resilience would be a yes or no. Is X democracy resilient? And it's a tick box, yes or no. And what happens if it's not resilient? What happens if there is a crack? I mean, there are problems, things happen, life is complicated. But does it mean that there's no going back for a certain situation just because the crack has set in? And I think that's where hope comes in, because it suggests that even if a democratic threshold has been broken, even if some of these problems in democracy that I mentioned have come in, there's still a way to renew democracy. There's still a way of claiming back democracy. I think the concept of resilience is important. What I'm not clear is how it helps once that crack has happened and once that threshold has been broken. But thanks for that question. I think it's important also for me to think about these two concepts.
Yeah, thanks, Indrajit. So the next question is from Varsha. It's Modi in India has brought on a lot of good things. Lots of people have faith in him and would like him to continue doing good. Do you feel this is wrong? Who can take over from him?
Yeah, I think this is a really important way to think about the point that Oznur, you made earlier about the hope that lots of these individuals have been able to spark. I mean, there's no question that lots of people have enormous faith in Mr. Modi. And it's not for me to say whether they're right or wrong in having that faith. I think what's important is that this is in politics, doubt is sort of a touchstone. It's important to question your beliefs, and it's important to question your faith even. And I can see lots of reasons why people have enormous levels of faith in politicians like Modi, but also Erdogan, in Trump, in Bolsonaro. And it's quite possible that they sort of see these politicians doing a great deal of good things. I think the question of right or wrong has to be decided on the grounds of what does this say about the most marginalized sections of society? What does it say about people who face daily drudgeries? What does this say about people who are sort of in the middle? And I think there are lots of well-documented instances of how regimes like Modi's, but also Bolsonaro's, Trump's, and Erdogan's have done a great deal to foment inequality, to foment religious divisions, to foment a polarization. And I think we've got to sort of look at the overall contributions of these gentlemen to the politics of their country. So I respect people who have faith in Messrs. Modi, Erdogan, Trump, Bolsonaro. As they say, some of these individuals are my best friends. No, they're not. But I just want to sort of say that that I can see why people have a great deal of faith in Modi. But I'm not sure that that's a great way to do politics. India's own previous history of democracy is a great example. Lots of people had enormous faith in Mrs. Gandhi back in the 1970s, with whom Modi is often compared. Mrs. Gandhi suspended democracy for the first and only time in India's post-colonial history, and many people thought it was for the good, because they said trains and planes ran on time, offices worked punctually, but clearly lots of Indians didn't. And I think ultimately it is for the people to sort of question the faith they have on things. Obviously, I have no idea of who can take over from him. I mean, I'm no oracle, but India has or is beginning. India's opposition parties are beginning to find their voice again. I think sometimes we believe that coalition politics is a bad thing, because it gives you a weak government. But if you look at India's own history, it's the biggest advances in democracy as well as economic growth have come when India has been run by coalition governments. Whether it was the liberalization of the 1990s, whether it's the enormous welfare programs of the 2000s, India is a rising power today. It's in the BRICS and all of that because of the rule under the coalition governments. So I think I don't want to sort of answer your question to say X or Y should take over from him. I can't do that, obviously. But I think having a coalitional sort of form of government is not a bad thing, which is what, by the way, we have in India at the moment. I mean, Modi is heading a coalition government. So there are interesting things, interesting ways to answer that question. Thanks for that.
That's great. Thank you, Indrajit. And the final question, it's from Etta. She says, you mentioned utopia. Do you think that utopian thinking is a threat to democracy? That's a good one.
Yeah, that's a deep one. I'm inclined to say yes. I'm inclined to say yes. Utopian thinking has resulted in some of the most awful sorts of social engineering projects in the world. Whether it's the sort of regime you had in Soviet Russia, the kind of regime you saw during the Cultural Revolution in China, Nazi Germany was an example of utopian thinking where want to create a perfect world. European colonialism, with its civilizational mission, was, after all, a utopia. There was an image of the perfect world that could be created. So I think any perfectionist project, any project that seeks to remove human imperfection and create the perfect man, as it were, or woman, or whatever creature, as it were, is a threat to democracy. There's absolutely no question of it. The idea that there are experts or there are certain people who know what is best for humanity, even if they might all claim to have the best interests of people at heart, and sometimes they probably do, I think is antithetical to democracy. It goes against the very grain of democracy. And I mean, I'm glad you asked this question because some of these characters that we are talking about, and this actually nicely ties in with the previous question as well. Yes, Erdogan and Modi and Trump are seen to be doing good things by their followers. But what they are really trying to do is to perfect Turkey or India or America. It's a perfect country. It's the perfect society. And the moment you have that element coming in, where you are refusing to sort of deal with the so-called imperfections, or you have an idea of what it means to be perfect, the moment you have an idea of what it means to be perfect, you're assuming things about how things are imperfect, right? And I thought the previous question sits very nicely. Modi is doing good things, great, but what does that mean? And who is he doing good things for? What's his image of the perfect sort of society that he would like India to be? or Bolsonaro, or and I keep talking about Turkey, India, Brazil, and the United States, but there are these characters dotted across the world. I think all of these are right-wing utopias. These are authoritarian utopias, which need to be pushed back, just as left-wing utopias ought to have been pushed back and were by their own citizens. So I think yes, I would say utopian thinking, no matter how much individuals, no matter how much our personal sort of views might align with utopian thinking, those are, inimical to democracy. Absolutely. Thank you. That was a great question to end on, and a very sobering one at that.
Yeah, and that was a great way to finalize the conversation, because once somebody wrote that the problem of our age is there's too much certainty and
Yes,
too much mobilized ignorance,
absolutely.
rather than everything is so clear in the minds of those people and those leaders, and there's no space for negotiation, dialogue, questioning,
Exactly.
and yeah,
Exactly.
it's
Exactly.
yeah.
I mean, I think if, the good things that Mr. Modi does, or Mr. Erdogan does, or Mr. Trump does, all these good things, if they were done with a little more consultation with political adversaries, a little more discussion with the public, you wouldn't have a utopian solution, of course, because these discussions are necessarily imperfect, but they would have been more democratic. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Indrajit, for this very insightful, thought-provoking conversation. It was great. And I feel more hopeful now.
Well, it is contagious, but thank you so much for leading this conversation. It is really great. And, the question sort of got you to think about the book and go back to the book and some of the assumptions there. And obviously, everyone in the audience, I mean, your questions again were just, very, very thought-provoking. And I'm glad you asked them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, the audience, for your questions. And thank you, the University of York, for organizing this public lecture. And see you next time.
Bye. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.